Good evening everyone and welcome to the day 2 of the Research Fellow Talks hosted by the Archives at NCBS. I'm Moses, I work as a web developer at the Archives. We are a public collecting center for the history of science in contemporary India. We have over 50 collections spread across the domains of ecology, mathematics, art, physics, grassroots activism, agriculture, and my favorite, space sciences. The archival material is in forms ranging from paper-based manuscripts to negatives to photographs, books, fine art, audio recording, scientific equipment, letters, and field and lab notes. We would like to thank the Arcadia Fund for supporting our archival work here, and TNQ Foundation for supporting the Research Fellowship Program. And with that, I would like to introduce our speaker and research fellow at the Archives, Achintya, Anita, Gurumurthy. Achintya has graduated with a Bachelor's of Arts and Laws degree from Jindal Global Law School. Their research deals with questions of caste, class, gender marginality in the history of the modern Indian judiciary, and the social and political past of people's movements. With that, I'd like to hand over to Achintya.
Thanks, Lucas. I hope I'm audible. So, thanks everyone for coming today. My talk is on the phenomenon of slum evictions, specifically of those who live on Bangalore's Keres. And I will be looking at the politics of this broadly from an urban geography perspective, but I will be largely relying on the perspectives of environmentalists from the archives at NCBS. I'd like to start off by thanking the archives team, who, in their daily work also, through the fellowship, I saw the invisible labor that goes behind the making of historical materials. And I think that with how I saw with how they related with every one of the materials, I think I take that sensibility of care in the materials that I handle going forward. So I really like to thank them for that. I'd also like to thank them for kind of helping me and training me with also kind of building a catalog. So helping me also understanding what is the entire labor behind this thing called archival processing. And I would also like to say with much gratitude that they kind of trusted me also to help out with sorting some of the ESG materials out. A big part of my presentation relies on the remarkable labor of ESG. So with that, my title is Between the Devil and the Deep Lake, Courts and Environmentalists on Evictions in Bangalore's Keres. Okay. So firstly, I just want to do a bit of kind of setting the ground. First is really why Bangalore. It's possible that we can study evictions of communities across the country, whether we see in the case of Kuvam River in Chennai, or we see in the Dal Lake in Srinagar, or we see in the banks of the Sabarmati in Ahmedabad. We see that there is this phenomenon of ecological evictions which is happening across the country, and predominantly resident welfare associations and largely bourgeois groups in the city are relying on environment as a discourse to evict people from the places in which they are staying. But Bangalore also, I think, is a very specific kind of space because it has a very specific history with the Keres. It has a very specific history with its lake and tank ecology, and also with the recent spate of eviction drives. I'm sure you are all very familiar. For instance, in the COVID-19 pandemic, we had mass eviction drives from tank beds, and the Member of Parliament from South Bangalore, Tejasvi Surya, even said that these are the people who are illegal Bangladeshi immigrants, right? These are people who are infiltrating our country. So these are the kind of discourses which are deployed when evictions are happening on tank beds. And so there is also very specific political economic kind of significance of Bangalore. We see that within the neoliberal kind of imagination of India, Bangalore is an emerging city, a global city, and its kind of IT promise is very important within the economic ambitions of the country. So there is a kind of inner driven need to maintain a particular image for the city. Parallelly along with this, we see also there are particular elite sensibilities which seek to preserve the image of the city in a particular way. So for instance, we know how upper class environmental groups have mobilized in cities against those who live in slums, and they have primarily argued that slums are polluting, right? They say that slums are disease-ridden, people who live in slums are lazy, slums are so on and so forth. But very importantly, they also say slums are polluted. They pollute the environment, they are kind of unsustainable within the urban ecoscape. Right, so we see that elite sensibilities of city beautification and aesthetics has generated a bourgeois environmentalism, and courts often have to kind of deal with bourgeois environmentalism, and often we see that courts overwhelmingly side with the petitioner who is from an upper class resident welfare association. So what we really see is that there is a link between environmental improvement and displacement done by these petitioners who kind of go about and do this. One very important thing that urban geographers have said about the city as a landscape is that they say that those who live in slums are not just understood as encroachers to the city. So if we look at the jurisprudence in many of the cases, resident welfare associations don't just say that these are encroachers to the city, they often say these are encroachers to the nation. They are violating the idea of the nation. They are not fit citizens of the nation, right? So we see that encroacher is used in this sense. And Gautam Bhan has shown that slum dwellers are understood not just as encroachers to the city, but they're understood as kind of insults to nationhood and insults to citizenship as an idea in itself. So I will actually use this idea of the encroacher, and if we go to the modern science archive, we see that the idea of the encroacher is used very differently by an environmentalist. An environmentalist understands an encroacher as anybody who comes in the way of water, right? So they will not understand it in the same way as a court or a resident welfare association does. Right, so my primary mode of argument is really looking at how the environmentalist takes the idea of the encroacher, rids it of all its caste class sensibilities, and actually reframes it as, you know, the encroacher is somebody who actually does something which is in contravention to the environment, but also in contravention to those who live with the environment. So we really see that there is something very progressive happening over here. Right? So I argue that looking at environmentalist interventions can help disentangle the problems posed by bourgeois environmentalism. Environmentalists have flipped the idea of the encroacher, and in doing so have helped offer alternative paradigms of understanding planning, ecology and housing rights. Now, primarily, I will just go into a little bit of what Plan, Occupy, Build and Occupy, Build plan is, which is basically the framework of understanding cities in the global south. Right, to all of us, if I ask anybody in this room, how is a city planned? People will say, okay, first we'll make a city plan, and then we will build the structures in cities. And then people will kind of go and occupy them, and then the cities kind of in the global south, we all know that that is not how cities happen, and especially slums. Bastis don't go like this, right? If you go to your own local slum or a slum that you have worked in and so on, you will notice that people have been living there for generations, right? They have been filling the electricity bill for maybe generations, they have been filling the water bills for generations, right? So the first what we see in the slum is a very peculiar temporality which seems to violate any other kind of planning temporality, right? First you occupy, right? You first see wasteland, wetland, right? And this is something Nisha also touched upon in her talk yesterday, which is governments just don't seem to have the patience to understand what is a wetland or what is a wasteland, right? But the slum actually has an immense patience for these kind of very ecologically sensitive places. A slum dweller will identify a land like this, first occupy it, then maybe build a little bit, maybe a tin shelter for some time, and then maybe do more, right? And this is what Gautam Bhan calls auto construction, right? So you build a little by little by little by little over generations, right? So when an eviction happens, it's not as though the court is immediately recognizing that some locality has come up and we have to remove it. Very often what happens is that people have been living there for generations, and they can even prove that they have been living there for generations, and then the court says, okay, you have to be evicted now. Right, so the function of the law also, which I will come to in a minute, but I'll just kind of deal with this temporality of planning. We see that auto construction is a primary mode of living in the global south city, and I also operate within this paradigm. I understand that the slum is something which first occupies, then builds, and then the plan is imposed on top of them. So I also don't understand the city plan to be a kind of clinical document which we should kind of follow like gospel. I understand that the plan is also a highly ideological tool. It is used by courts to say that slums are define the city plan, right? And under what circumstances does the court recognize that slums actually should be evicted and are define the plan and so on, right? So within this framework, also because I'm a lawyer, I also want to understand the role of law within this framework, and so I understand that the law is ultimately a grey and ideological kind of tool, right? If I'm sure all of us we all live in Bangalore, for instance, which is a city in the global south. We know that all of us violate the city's plan in some way, right? You know that in the house you live in, half of it has already occupied the footpath. You know that you and your neighbor are fighting for the compound that you both share, right? So the entire city is at odds with the plan, right? So it's not just that the slum is at odds with the plan, but fundamentally, the function of the law is to police subaltern informality, right? It is to police the slums informality while simultaneously valorizing elite informality, right? So it says, okay, fine, if you want to violate all these zoning laws and build this building, it's totally fine, right? We know, for instance, that metros across the country to this date don't do environmental impact assessments, right? So can you imagine the degree of informality, elite informalities that exists in these cities, right? The state doesn't care about the plan. Elite residential welfare groups actually don't care about the plan, right? Nobody cares about the plan. But when it comes to slums, everybody says care about the city plan, care about, why is that JJ cluster over there? So this is also my understanding of the law, and I also intervene within this understanding, which is that the law ultimately valorizes elite informalities while simultaneously devaluing subordinate informalities. So just quickly, I just want to go through the spate of judgments because I do intend to kind of look at the legal archive and also see what the legal archive is saying about Bangalore's Keres. But today I will focus more exclusively on the ESG archive. But quickly, I just want to show 4 different judgments on what courts are saying about those who live on tank beds, right? From Pujari Peddanna, the court says the hutment dwellers and slum dwellers on the land in question and the construction labourers from North India are causing nuisance. The hutmates use the open ground as toilets and pollute the environment. And I will come to this, why there is so much sewage in our lakes. This we will see from the actual Environmentalists archive. Right? It says we have more than 500 boys and girls staying in the hostel college and they are facing threats every day from slum dwellers. Right? So this is the kind of crazy anxiety which is actually being riled up against people who live in slums. In the second case, we see that all the waste that is being thrown in the Alsud lake is being attributed to a slum lake. Huge quantity of solid waste, including POP idol, mattress, furniture, plastic items are being disposed in Alsud lake by the local residents, a slum area. Right? So the court is in parenthesis immediately clarifying, don't worry, we are not talking about all your apartments which are around the lake, don't worry about that, we are talking about the slum which is on the lake. Right, we see in this Farida versus Commissioner, a slum person is referred to as a slum grabber. And the court says that any drug offender, gambler, gunda or immoral traffic offender, right, or slum. So this is how slum dwellers are also understood. And later the court says that these people can be detained without much warrant or anything, right. So the court is saying no laws also should apply to these people. In B. Krishna Bhatt, which is supposed to be considered in fact one of the most progressive judgments on lake privatization in Karnataka, the court says it is irrational, unjustifiable, unethical, unhygienic and antisocial to plan a slum society. Right? So there is a particular hatred towards the slum, but the court is also not kind of devising any ways to go beyond it. Right? So later there is no kind of winding up and saying, oh, right to housing is a fundamental right, nothing like that. The court is just saying they are living there, they should not live there. And that is how sort of things are moving on. Right now, why should we really look towards the ecologist? So the first thing I really think is what is the history saying, and historical interventions have shown that there is a very intrinsic relationship between those who live on Bangalore's lakes and the lake ecology. Right? So anthropologists have shown that for the longest time, those who had the local knowledge knew exactly how to silt the lake, they knew how to deweed the lake, they knew how to remove obstructions so the water flow would be smooth, right? So those of you who are familiar with Bangalore's geography, and I'm in a room of scientists, so I don't want to kind of impose, but from what I understand, I know that Bangalore is kind of 3 valleys and there are kind of interconnected canals connecting all of these lakes, right? So the function of those who used to live on the lakes were people who would also do this labor, and with what we see is that there are cycles of migration and displacement, and that knowledge is being lost. So Janaki Nair in Promise of Metropolis actually says this, that those who built Vidana Sauda, which is considered one of the symbols of Bangalore, are actually people who lived on Sampangi Tank. And these were people who lived in Sampangi Tank for generations. And after they finished building Vidana Sauda, they were evicted by the government and then resettled. And they were actually resettled into another tank bed. They were resettled into Bhairasandra Tank, which is one of the biggest slums today, Tilak Nagar slum area. Right? So there is something very intrinsic about this relationship between the environment and the working class dwellers of the city, right? So we cannot just immediately dismiss and say give them housing elsewhere or give them shelter elsewhere. We have to understand actually that the people who live on this, in this very, very fragile ecology actually understand a lot about it. The second thing is that urban geographers and anthropologists have also shown this kind of very intrinsic relationship. But I think one glaring gap is this, right? They say that, oh, bourgeois environmentalism, right? They are immediately suspicious of any environmentalist kind of interjection because they think immediately that this is something which is going to lead into a cascading effect, right? The moment you talk about environment, then ultimately you're going to end up evicting people from the slum bed, right? So there is a kind of also distrust, I would say, from the perspective of urban geographers towards environmental discourse because they have faced so much, we have had generations of so much of this embouchement of environmental discourse that people are immediately very scared when you bring up discourses of environment. So I think in this context, it's actually important to actually say what are environmentalists saying. Do they actually advocate that people who live on tank beds should be evicted, or are they saying something more? So I think something very unique that ecologists do bring to the archive is also from their work, I think they have a very sensorial grasp over the minute changes that are happening in the tank area. So many of the annexures of ESG court documents are actually ornithologists' reports about bird life in a particular lake. Right? So actually I think of these sources also as very rich social history sources, because they are giving us very minute sensorial details as to what is that lake and how was that lake, right? So I think that ecologists are actually very special people, and I think that also they are very unique in their perspective, because I think that they don't treat the right to property as kind of inviolable, right? So I also imagine that an ecologist perspective can maybe also offer alternative regimes of right to property. So primarily I'm trying to think about whether both of these things are something that ecologist perspectives can do, which can maybe push us a step further in the literature. Right? These are maps. I'm going to show you 4 maps from the MOD archive. These maps, I would just let you take a minute to see. So these are all tank areas, if you see. Bangalore is kind of interlaced with tank areas, right? And this small bit of green, as you can imagine, is Carbon Park, which is going to become smaller and smaller. But one thing we can very much see, this is 1880. This map is an 1880 map, and this is a 1900 map. You can clearly see that Bangalore is interlaced by a very nice, the map is at least interlaced with the blue, right? The plan, if these lakes and tanks have existed historically for so long, why is it that the plan is still sort of unable to accommodate the idea of the wetland in its plan? So I just want to just chronologically show you the dwindling nature of Bangalore's lakes. So we see in 1880, in 1900 things seem to be going so quite well. But in 1960 we still see 5 or 6 patches of big blue. But the moment we enter 2000, we see that water is kind of sequestered to a very, very small portion of the city, right? And this is something which is quite alarming. And I think that sort of we have to understand that where is the water going, right? And I think anybody who travels on Sarjapur Road on the day it's rained, or any of the big arterial roads, Ring Road, you will know where the water is going. The water is going in the bumper of your car, right? So this water has to go somewhere. And still somehow planners are unable to kind of understand what to do about this water. Now, the archive also is showing that city planners are sort of unable and unwilling to understand what a wetland is, and the kind of seasonal patterns in which the wetland looks different, right? So this is from 1903. You might think that this is something that the Lake Development Authority came out with in 2015 if you see the language, but this is actually from 1903. And over here you can see the tank rarely fills now and is an eyesore at the entrance of the town from the railway station. And he's talking about a Dharmabudi tank, which you guys might be familiar with, is a tank which is right opposite Majestic railway station, or it was opposite railway station, which is now the bus stand. So if you see, the bus stand is also in a kind of soup bowl-like structure, presumably where the water was at some point, right? And so they're also saying, let's just convert it into a small park. Let's just close off the boundaries, right? And we see constantly that there is a need to privatize the city landscape and privatize lake landscapes, right? So they are not understanding that why this water is seasonal. So they are saying, it's an eyesore and let's remove it from the railway station. The second thing I'm going to show you is very fascinating. So if you actually Google the word Raja Kalove, which is the main canals through which water flows, you will actually get this website. You will not get the history of Raja Kaloves and how they were made in Bangalore. You will actually get this site, government-powered site about is your property on a Raja Kalove, right? So the government has already anticipated, and the algorithm has already anticipated that somehow you are violating the city plan and your house is on a canal, right? And this is what is very fascinating. And we will also see this as we go to the ecologist archive, that much of the city is actually on these very defining structures which kind of help the water to flow. Now, I think one of the challenges is that now I've said ecologists so many times, but the voices of ecologists are quite heterogeneous. They're not kind of homogeneous at all. And when we see the perspectives of, for instance, state environmentalists, they still come with a kind of baggage about the city plan that is quite apparent. So if we see, for instance, the first is Yellappa Reddy, and Yellappa Reddy will be there if you go and see on the archives, you will be able to see all of Yellappa Reddy's documents, right? And in this he says, right, we need to stop any further unauthorized developments coming in the green belt. The green belt, as you all may know, is the strip of circle of green which acts to stem the city's outward growth, and this is something Yellappa Reddy designed. And basically what happens conversely is in the 1990s, after Bangalore kind of builds a green belt, is that builders use it actually as an opportunity to kind of privatize land around the green belt and say, okay, this is a farm property or this is a forest view property. And so actually Yellappa Reddy wanted the city to stop growing, but what happens is that there's a mushrooming of real estate real estate boom which happens around the green belt, and the city actually grows outward after that. And the green belt also, I think in the 1990s, we all might be familiar with those debates, right, that environment should remain untouched from human kind of intervention, and this is something with colonial baggage. We know that there is a hatred towards those who dwell in the forest, right? Though the sahibs can go and hunt whenever they want, there is still kind of a criminalization of those who live in the forest and their work. We see that kind of baggage also come within Yellappa Reddy's work, and I urge you all to actually read his notes, which is one of the very important documentations which I rely on, in which a lot of this baggage about the green belt having, you know, farmland, or the green belt having people living in it, right? There is a kind of anxiety around this. The second text is from Zafar Fateh Ali papers, which is the environmental conservation papers, and this particular letter is from a Birders magazine, right? And over here the discussion is about the creation of a joggers track around Madiwala Lake. So over here also they say this, that we should not create a joggers track also because it will, whatever, the bird life will be disrupted, but also it will be likely used by a floating population for washing, etc. Right? So there is some kind of disdain towards those who live around the lake, and this is also can be historically attributed, both of these are the texts coming around the 90s, that there is some attitude, there is some baggage towards this which can also be attributed to neoliberal ideas around environment and environmental conservation, with a particular baggage dating all the way back from colonialism. So even the Lakshman Rao report, which is actually cited by the ESG group in the courts, right? They go to the court to say why are lakes being privatized in Bangalore, and unfortunately they also have to rely on similar things. So the Lakshman Rao report, which was released in '86, which was a committee set up by the government of Karnataka to find out the state of Bangalore's lakes, right? So they realized from 1,000 Keres they are down to 200, and they realized that something is up and we should do something. So Lakshman Rao actually authored a report about what is to be done, and this was actually cited quite extensively later by efforts by ESG to tell the court, listen, this has been done by the Karnataka government in the past, it is actually important, you know, actually look at it. So over here we see this, right, that we should make sure that no layout should be allowed to be formed in the tank bed areas by BDA or any other body, right? So they also have to unfortunately rely on these sources. But let's see what they do. What is the kind of new interventions that has come, that environmentalists bring. And I also want to kind of add a caveat that what is perhaps different from ESG from other ecological approaches is perhaps a very close connection to people's movements in the country, right? There's a particular discourse or a particular nuance which they bring in their ecological interventions, which I think is very important. And I urge everyone over here also, I think when the ESG materials are able to be accessed by everyone, to really go and see the vibrant political society, civil society engagement that particular archival documents actually show. So this is a really fascinating advertisement. I was wondering why is an advertisement an annexure in the first writ petition that they filed to the court in 2008. In 2008, they challenged the Lake Development Authority, Karnataka Lake Development and Conservation of Lakes Authority, which actually has been understood as a completely toothless body. They were toothless against corporates, but they were completely toothful, as you can imagine, against the slums. Right? And they went to the court saying, why are you privatizing lakes? Right? So this ad actually is a very good documentation of how lakes have been privatized, right? So the worst, most evil corporates, as one might imagine, are being given lake and tank beds to be managed. Toward what end, right? The court also in this 2008 writ petition says there is no reason to, for instance, have a ticketing charge at the lakes, right? Why are you doing these kind of things? Why are you privatizing the lake? So we can really clearly see that there is a very clear evidence that there is a move under the name of lake conservation actually to privatize and individualize lakes as spaces. But the other thing that I really want to show is this, which is sort of my fundamental argument about the flipping of the encroacher. Overwhelmingly, we see that the archive shows that encroachers to the environment in Bangalore are in fact not its slum residents. In fact, it is the state and private real estate and private entities which are actually at odds with the city's environment. So the encroacher is not a slum dweller, the encroacher is actually the government and private builders. And this of course is very clearly showing that of course these are the people entitled to the lake, but of course we also see that the state is legalizing this very patently illegal process. Why are you calling for open calls for tenders for lakes? Like what is toward what social end are you justifying such a policy? The Lake Development Authority later was shut down also because the courts also realized that they were not doing anything, or rather they were acting exclusively with kind of very categorically in private interests. Now this is a very fascinating annexure to one of the writ petitions that ESG filed, which is a later series of writ petitions they filed after their first lake privatization writ petition, which actually, so once the first judgment comes out, the judgment says lake water is very important, we should have no obstruction towards the water flowing into lake, and if there is any of these kind of impediments, the government should step in and help out sort of the environment. They also placed a positive obligation on the Bangalore municipality, so BBMP, to actually manage the lakes, and they said you have a positive obligation to manage these lakes well. So when the ESG realized that they have this judgment in their favor, they didn't kind of relax. The next thing they did was really go and survey every tank bed and every lake bed that there was in Bangalore. And anytime they found out that there was something in contravention with the law, they immediately raised an application with the court. So this is one of the annexures to one of their petitions, which actually cites is a CAG report in 2015, right? And we can see that exclusively it is a BWSSB, sewage, defecation, sewage, right? So almost exclusively it seems to be BWSSB that's dumping stuff in Bangalore lakes, and you can see these are lakes across Bangalore. This is also a really fascinating map, right? We see that primarily those who are in the buffer zone, right? And these are actually the very important areas for a lake, as one would imagine. So, I mean, it is not just that one small puddle which holds the water, but also the immediate area around, which is very important to the ecological survival of the lake, and as well as the survival of the life around the lake. And so the buffer zones, as one would imagine, immediately becomes very viable in real estate terms to actually be lake view and so on apartments. So we actually very funnily see that all of them in the buffer zone are private apartments, with one exception. I think there is one slum, but every other apartment or there is construction of private apartments happening, right? So exclusively we see that it is elite informality against the lake. This is a very funny thing, and this is something I saw, and in the title it says encroachment of lake by a slum, and I was quite shocked. Why is it that the ESG application is arguing this? And then as you read, you will find out actually that in Subramanyapura Lake, it is actually the government that has evicted a slum from somewhere else and is actually settling a new slum in the lake bed. Right? So we see very ironically that under a Ashraya scheme, under a legal scheme, the government is doing a very patently illegal thing. It is actually violating an order of the court to again resettle a slum over there. Right? And you can imagine the cycles of migration that slums actually undergo through this, right? You are evicted from one place and somewhere else, then you are evicted from some other place and sent somewhere else. And within the legal framework for slums in the country, I will just explain, mostly courts go by a cut-off date system. So they decide, okay, if you have come before 1981, we'll let you stay, and if you have proof to show you come before a particular date, we'll let you stay. Otherwise, you have to leave. So you can only imagine when people in slums live in these highly tenuous areas and they're constantly shifted, they lose legitimate claim more and more to the place that they get to stay. Right? So we can see again that it is state informality that has actually settled a slum in a tank bed. Now the character also of the elite informality is something that I would like to probe at. Is it just that lakes are being privatized and lakes are being polluted and lakes the commons of the lake commons are kind of being privatized by the state and private entities? Is it just that? And perhaps not. The archive actually shows that also along with this kind of neoliberal privatization, we see a very patent communalization also happening. So in Belur Lake, very bizarrely, one day they kind of set up a concrete Shiva statue, right? And they go to the court saying on what basis, right? And this is actually very funny because ecologists actually have to rally the government a lot saying, don't just build one puddle and fence it off and leave it. Actually build small islands, because a wetland ecology is such that I think different kind of creatures live at different levels of water. So when you have this kind of dispersed island system within the lake, it also promotes the existence of certain kind of life. Right? So they rallied a lot to get this Beru Lake island set up. And we immediately see that this statue is there, and one day they remove the plastic and this is the statue that's there. So this is the kind of informality that environmental groups have to fight against every day. Now I would also like to say that this is not just about housing, right? When we talk about elite informality in Bangalore's lakes, it's not just privatization in the name of real estate. We also see that elite informality attacks the very idea of city life in itself. So through the instance of the Cubbon Park Smart City project, we see that, and I'm sure even in the previous maps that I showed, you can see that Cubbon Park also as an area is kind of dwindling, right? As it comes up here, we see a big chunk of land, and many of you might know that now there are only few entrances to Cubbon Park, but that was not the case previously. Right? So Cubbon Park was highly accessible, and as we see, it gets smaller and smaller, right? And as we see, it gets smaller and smaller, right? So even the move to build a smart city inside Cubbon Park, which is in violation of its own wetland ecology, we should also recognize this as an elite informality that is at odds with Bangalore's Keres ecosystem, right? So in one of the petitions, they actually say this: Cubbon Park is a part of smart city project, right? And one of the reasons that they disagree with the smart city project is very interesting. They don't just say that it disrupts the wetland ecology. They say it disrupts the communal life, the cultural life surrounding the wetland ecology of Bangalore. So they say from the extensive re-engineering and concretization underway presently, it appears that the park's wetlands will be forfeited forever. This is likely to fundamentally alter the ecology of the park, as activity undertaken is in modifying the canal leading into what was the Sampangi Lake, now the Kantirva Stadium, of which only a vestigial remain exists as a Kalyani. This Kalyani plays a crucial role in the syncretic Karaga festival that is unique to Bangalore. So they don't say it is disrupting the wetland system. They say that the Karaga festival cannot continue if you do this, right? So it's very beautiful how they're actually framing the ecological question. Now, the question which arises, and I will kind of wrap up at this stage. Yeah, I have 8 minutes. What are the solutions which really happen? What are the solutions that the archives give? Is it just that they give elite informality? Encroachers are actually the state, primarily the state and private builders. Slums have little to do with being encroachers of Bangalore lake systems. Are they providing any solutions, and are these solutions global south centric? Are they kind of coming from the roots? This is a very beautiful comic, and this is actually going to be there as part of the charts collection of the ESG lake materials. And it's a comic strip on the lake systems of Bangalore, in which I think it's a comic strip for a child. So why is a lake important? And then they say, oh, people come to wash their clothes in the lake, oh, children come to play in the lake, oh, X comes to do X in the lake, and so on. And I love this because they say, many people also depend on our lakes for their livelihoods. If there is a fee to enter the lake, fishermen will no longer be able to support their family. So they very much understand that there is a kind of correlative kind of symbiotic relationship. And this, I think the solution is sort of I'm going to think of a solution by looking at this particular page in the comic strip. Two things that they do, of course, is by flipping encroachment. One is that in their response to an order regarding the Karnataka Lake Development Authority Bill in 2015, they actually say we should have scheduled caste, scheduled tribes people with specific knowledge on this question to sit on these committees. Let's not have these random technocratic dudes coming from here and there to sit on these committees. Let's have people who have local specialized knowledge actually come and sit on these committees and actually govern lake ecologies. The second thing they do, and I think that the ESG archive is actually exclusively about this, which is local self-government. Right? I think when I was processing the ESG materials, I was like, I was feeling very much that this is a lesson in 8th standard civics. So a lot of what they do is really looks towards empowering local municipal bodies towards action. So they actually set up a three-tier system on reconstituting lake protection committees, and they look at their own writ petition to help through this. So what the court also kind of suggests is in reliance with their submissions to the court. So they suggest this three kind of layer of protection: Karnataka Lake Protection Apex Committee at the level of the state, and then you have a Bangalore metropolitan area, and then district levels protection and rehabilitation committees. Right, and at each of these levels, they have devised kind of very elaborate ways by which local citizens can actually think about how to govern the lakes themselves. Now, I'll just end with kind of two larger points about what I'm trying to get at, which is really about the fact that Gautam Ban says that housing is not about housing at all, which basically means that when you resettle a slum, it's not just about providing housing to a person, right? So let us say that there is actually a slum which is at odds with an environment or completely blocking the flow of water somewhere. We should not just completely dismiss it and say, let's move them somewhere. Okay, maybe you have to move them somewhere. Now, when that happens, what really happens? Gautam Ban says that it is not just about survival, right? So it is not just about, do they have a roof to cover their heads? Because when you look at a slum, there is a lot of particular aspects of life which go around a slum, right? A slum locality comes somewhere because somebody can access their workspace well, right? They have affordable transport to maybe reach their workplace, or they're able to walk and go to a workplace. The slum has a particular collective and cultural life of itself, right? So when we do this task of rehabilitation, we have to ensure that the bundle of rights that existed when they were originally inhabiting a particular space, that bundle of rights continues to exist. And I think that can only happen when you have very close and local knowledge about the original slum, that you can resettle them to a place where they will be able to continue their life, all aspects of their life as it was. The second thing I would just like to end with Solomon Benjamin, whose work I urge you all to look at, simply because it's a very close documentation of the gods that people worship in Bangalore's lakes. So as many of you know, one of the oldest deities which was found is an 8th century rock deity, which is a lake deity in Bangalore, right? And so people have been worshipping lakes since then. Right, so we have a very historic relationship with lakes and very historic relationship of indigenous populations who have devised their own system of rights and entitlements with regard to the lake. Right, so Solomon Benjamin urges us to move away from a logic of real estate towards a logic of spirits. And in that very regard, I think that we need to move away from a logic of real estate towards a logic of spirits. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Achintya, for the wonderful talk. And there was a sneak peek into our ESG collection as well. That's wonderful. It will launch probably in a month. We would like to take some questions if there are any.
In your perspective, you will say this slum should be there only, or what's your opinion on that?
So I think we have to see it in a case-by-case basis. In many cases, the original inhabitants of slums, of those tank beds no longer exist. So in that case, if there is a really instance where the slum is squatting directly on the tank bed area, there may be a situation where they have to move. But I think we have to see it in a case-by-cases basis. In many of the cases, in the judgments that I cited, many of those instances, these were not communities which were directly coming in the way of the lake ecology. But still the courts used the pretext of the lake ecology to evict that slum. I am saying that maybe should not happen.
In terms of actually corruption and other things, so as you rightly said, actually that slum people are, their contribution towards lake ecology or destroying lake ecology is very significant, it's very minimal. But even recently I submitted my project report in IAC, so regarding the evaluation of Bangalore lake ecosystems.
Okay.
So where actually even I dealt with diatoms, microorganisms, like microbes, how it contribute to lake ecology.
Okay.
So now what is the current state? So it was fantastic.
I would be.
But I think we have to really look at the broader perspective, because at least now, so within the city where is densely developed, where so like so government now they left they cannot do anything. They are in that state. At least new areas like Bangalore, now they are doing this new layouts, BDA.
Yeah.
So actually they also, in my perspective, they are not taking care and they are not following their own regulations
At all. Yeah.
So actually, rightly what you said that wetlands. they are not caring. Wetlands now they are converting to layouts, but they don't law says that they should not touch that. It should be really protected. But I think government is not taking proper decisions, and I also put my views in that my project report, where actually we have that means we are not well educated or understood what is its real effect on human kind. That one has to understand. So see, when that understanding comes, at least people will protest or object. Look, what you are doing is wrong. But this big layout is thousands of acres is happening. They're not caring. See, what was the original lake area? See, lake area is not just as you said that water stagnation area. But actually, if you take that, actually I have also taken one point that encroachment also is one of the auditing or evaluation of the ecosystem. But in my observation, I felt even government is not ready to do survey.
Certainly, yeah.
See, even that CAG report of 2015, but they have told so many things, but even after 10 years, nothing has been done on that points. I think people has to really think, okay, where we are living and what is happening and what is its effect on us. I think young generation has to come up and really they have to think. If not, they have time, but of course we have to really educate in that way. Then only we can get into the sustainable living.
Thank you so much for saying this. I think it is also a question of priorities, certainly. And actually, I didn't show that. Even the most important projects like Nice Road and all, we see that Hoskerhalli Lake is completely fully overflowing onto Nice Road, and still they are doing nothing about it. So we see even in the most big development projects in Bangalore, the government is actually not caring at all. So I completely agree. So thank you so much.
In case of even, I also pointed out why floods.
Yeah.
The waterways.
Yeah.
So again, to regenerate there, now hundreds of kilometers. This Rajakalway construction spending crores of multiple crores of rupees. I brought all these points.
I would be very interested to later learn more, sir, if you happen to. Thank you, sir.
Sure. Nice talk, Achintya. Just two quick questions. What is the sort of lifespan of the ESG collection, and do you get a sense from the collection that when do they start to get an understanding of engaging with the lakes here in Bangalore, and how are they tied in with civic groups in the city as well as, like you mentioned, larger, wider India-wide?
You said the time span of the little collection, right? So from the photographs I said, is it okay to share this? It is, right? Yeah. So I would say 1980s is when I think the earliest can be dated, going up to 2020s. And yes, very much, I would say that they started, I think the date, if I had to put one date towards when they start engaging with Bangalore's lake ecology, it would be 2008, when they filed the writ petition. But they actually have a very long engagement with Bangalore's water systems and Karnataka's water systems before that. So in the 1980s and 90s only, they have a Save Arkavati Bachao Andolan, and it is not just connected to political groups in Bangalore actually. So if you see the ESG archive, you will find a lot of photographs of Medha Patkar and people from Narmada Bachao Andolan actually coming and taking part in Karnataka movements for water. So it's very fascinating. They have very good connection towards people's movements across the country. With respect to civil society and organizations, people's organizations in Bangalore, there is a lot of material with engagements with Vimochana, which is a women's feminist organization in Bangalore, and many of actually their press conferences and meetings are actually held in Vimochana office. So if you can, we've also put a description of that it is in Vimochana office. So that is, I think that there is also a lot of kind of symbiotic sharing. So even though Vimochana's work doesn't directly deal with environmental questions at all, I think they must have come to an arrangement that you can use our office spaces if you need to do a bigger meeting. In terms of other organizations, they have taken up a lot of work with the Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan from Rajasthan. So they actually in 2002-2003 they attended also a right to information conference with MKSS in Rajasthan, Devdungri. And in the archive, you can actually see that they protest a lot of things which come from the right to information and right to food movements. So there is a whole lot of materials on them protesting the use of Aadhaar as a UID system, which is directly from the right to food movement, MKS's right to food movement. And we see also that they have a lot of materials on how to file an RTI, how to reach a local BBMP office, those kind of things. So they, I think, just from the back of my mind, I can see that in Vimochana they've engaged a lot in Bangalore. But outside of Bangalore, MKSS and Narmada Vacha Andolan are the main movements that they've engaged with.
Okay, that's it. I suppose we have snacks and tea outside in the theater. Please join us. And if you need our guest tools, we can downstairs at your place. So the basement of the is. Thank you.